Today's episode is one I've been really looking forward to. I'm sitting down with Mickey Trescott, someone who has played a foundational role in the Autoimmune Protocol, or AIP, from the very beginning. Mickey is an author, she's a nutrition professional, and co-founder of Autoimmune Wellness, where she's helped grow AIP from a small online community into a widely used research supported approach for managing autoimmune disease. She's also trained over 1,000 practitioners in applying AIP in real world settings. And today we're talking about her brand new book, The Autoimmune Protocol, which is the first major update to AIP in over a decade. So if you've been curious about AIP, if you've been overwhelmed by it, even if you've tried it and struggled or just want to know more, this conversation is going to give you a much more realistic, sustainable, and empowering way to think about AIP. Hello, Thyroid Thrivers, and welcome back to another episode of the Thyroid Healthy Bites podcast, with bi-weekly episodes dedicated to helping you eat well, live well, and feel well. I'm Ginny Mahar, a functional medicine health coach, cordon bleu chef, and your thyroid health and cooking coach. So if you're ready to get inspired, informed, and empowered with thyroid-friendly food and lifestyle topics, expert interviews, and tales from the healing journey, you're in the right place, friend. Let's dig in. Hi, Mickey. Welcome to the show. I'm so excited to have you here and to dig into this conversation today about what I think of as one of the most powerful tools that we have in our Thrivers toolkit, the Autoimmune Protocol, or AIP. So welcome, Mickey. I'm so glad to have you here on Thyroid Healthy Bites.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really excited about having more conversation about AIP.
It's something that's been really powerful on my own healing journey. You are also a thyroid thriver, fellow Hashimoto's patient. We have a lot to cover today, and this tool, it isn't new, but I think, for people who are maybe new to the journey, it is something that is very important, I think, for people to know about, be aware of as a helpful option in our toolkit. So I'd love to start, for anyone new to your work, you've been so foundational in this space, for well over a decade. I'd love to maybe just start with your story. Can you take us back to your own autoimmune journey and how AIP first came into your life?
Yeah. So I was diagnosed with two autoimmune conditions about 15 years ago, Hashimoto's and celiac. And at the time, I was 26. I had been suffering from various health complaints for about a year and a half, 2 years. I kind of have the common story of going to my doctor and then, getting dismissed, especially with the thyroid, the classic thyroid symptoms. At the time, I didn't really know that they were thyroid symptoms. I didn't really know how to advocate for myself. So I was, frankly, they looked at me and said, "You're young, you look healthy, you can't possibly be experiencing what you're complaining of," which at the time was extreme coldness in my extremities, hair loss, really crippling anxiety. I was having a lot of trouble sleeping. I was just so tired. And this had come kind of on the heels of like a very active and normal kind of like young adulthood college time where I was like rock climbing and cycling and running, and like I ate very healthy. I was vegan. I was cooking a lot of my own food. So it kind of came out of the blue, and all of that dismissal really gave me the courage to start researching. Maybe, I learned about thyroid conditions. I kind of put things together with the symptoms that I was having. And ultimately, I did end up getting a diagnosis of Hashimoto's, but then I was told, your thyroid levels are normal and there's nothing we can do for you. And kind of in the last few months of that seeking journey, I started to have neurological problems. I got an MRI that showed I had some white matter lesions in my brain. I also was having pleurisy, which is inflammation of the lining of the lungs, which is like very, very painful. I had a friend that was like, "You just need to learn how to meditate." And I was like, "I feel like I'm being stabbed by a bunch of tiny knives every time I breathe, but thank you." So I had some markers for like connective tissue autoimmune diseases, but ultimately I got the Hashimoto's, the celiac. The other stuff was like, wait and see, you need to be sick for far longer before we'll diagnose you. This was kind of back in the day of like pre-existing conditions. before Affordable Care Act. So, if I got a diagnosis of something gnarly, that would stick with me and I would be uninsurable. At the time, I wasn't insured. So it was very, very complicated, but just really felt like I didn't have any options within the conventional system. I'd kind of gone through all of those channels and I was still sick. I had lost my job. I was bedridden and I was desperate to do anything that would help me feel better. And so that's kind of the phase that I found AIP. Now, when I say I found AIP or the autoimmune protocol, it was really like a sentence of a thought in a couple different communities. So, functional medicine communities have been using elimination diets for a long time. The ancestral health community was using, paleo and ancestral health, like thinking about like what are we eating now that we weren't eating before. And both researchers and thinkers in both these communities around the same time had this idea that maybe people with autoimmune disease shouldn't eat certain foods. So I kind of latched onto that, continued my research, couldn't really find anybody who had done this. Like I was working without a provider. I was just, Googling on my own. And I actually found a group of women who were in a similar situation. And, at the time, blogs were all the rage. So I started blogging about, my own health stuff, just putting it on the internet for everyone to see. For some reason, I didn't even think twice about it back then. And I found some other women who were doing the same thing. They happened to be people who became key leaders in the AIP space, like Sarah Ballantyne and Jamie Hartman, and we all had different autoimmune conditions. So IBD, psoriasis, multiple sclerosis, but we all noticed that we were feeling better using just this elimination approach. So really that's kind of the foundation, like where the AIP movement came from. Nobody really gets credit for actually starting it, but I think the community, it's been a community project of a lot of different thinkers and obviously people like Sarah Ballantyne with her research PhD level skills. Like she formulated kind of the original, like, how long do we do this and why, based on a bunch of theoretical stuff. But that really planted the seed for then the AIP community to grow and more people to be interested. And that's kind of how I started doing what I do now, was out of that process.
I thank you for sharing that story. I really think of you as such a pioneer in this space too. And it's cool to hear sort of the origin story, right, of how all these minds came together out of a personal need for, relief, for feeling better, for lowering inflammation. When was the moment for you where you felt like, or just realized this is actually working? Like, what changed for you physically or emotionally when things started to kind of click with AIP?
Yeah, so I did not experience early or quick success with AIP, but at the time that I had started transitioning my diet, so again, I had been vegan, so there were a couple things that I was doing in my diet at the same time. I was trying to introduce animal products, which was emotionally and like very challenging for me. I was trying to introduce things that were actually triggers, so like eggs, scrambled eggs, like this is a pretty common when you're going to start eating animal products again. People say like, scrambled eggs, fish. The eggs were not working for me. So I was dealing with some food reactions and then, emotional needs with the transitioning to eating meat. That took months. Once I got to the point where I figured out, okay, animal proteins, seafood, this is all feeling really good in my body. I actually found that like red meat, after I would eat it, I would feel warm, which for at the time I was so cold. Like my body temperature was 93 degrees when I took it with the thermometer. And of course I'd gone to the doctor and showed them that and they still were like, we are not going to medicate you, which I to this day I think is just so wild. But I actually had a rise in body temperature after I started eating specifically like red meat. And that was the thing that was like, okay, there's something physically happening to me when I am eating these foods. Now with all my nutrition education, I understand like the B vitamins and, the protein and the nourishment that I was giving myself that I was just so depleted, especially with like
Mhm.
celiac disease. But I would say for sure that was the moment really when I introduced red meat, which I know is probably pretty specific to me because I was vegan and I was depleted in this very specific way that maybe not everyone coming to AIP feels that, but that was really powerful for me.
Yeah, wow, that's incredible. And you're coming to this like me as a chef. I love talking to fellow chefs about it. So tell me a little bit about how that played into things for you in terms of like, what do I want to do with this? you know,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so I had had a private previous job. Actually, my only job right out of college was actually working as a personal chef. I got really lucky. It was 2007, everything was like collapsing and jobs were really hard to come by. I had studied music, so I really had not much to go on. And I got this job basically working under a bunch of really skilled private chefs. I would go shopping for them. I'd go to the farmer's market. I would do a bunch of prep work. And then ultimately, I learned how to cook from them and I would, be their kitchen assistants. And some of them had like a specific medicinal background, so like Ayurvedic or Chinese medicine. Some of them were just like, you know, perfectly trained, like traditional chefs. But I learned cooking technique and everything from that. And then I moved away from that town and, left that job and was kind of like sad to leave it. But then when I got sick, I kind of circled back on like, I don't have a job now. What am I going to do when I get better? And I really wanted to incorporate nutrition. It was so powerful in my own life. And so that's really what started me on the blogging. First just what am I going to eat? And then having this community of people who were kind of looking for the same thing, blogging about some recipes, turned into like a personal project that then was like kind of a group project, and then ultimately became my first cookbook, was just publishing that, all the AIP recipes that I had come up with when I was going through my own healing journey.
And your cookbooks, I know, were like the first on my shelf for AIP. Your initial autoimmune paleo cookbook was, I mean, one of the first AIP cookbooks and came out right around the time I had my first foray into AIP. And I was so grateful for that. I've got
Oh,
all your books now. And so I'm really excited to, hear more about this new book and add it to my collection. I did want to kind of hear at the outset of the show, just in case there's people listening who are like, wait, I'm not really sure what AIP is. Can you kind of give us the nutshell version of like what
yeah.
is the autoimmune protocol?
Yeah, so the autoimmune protocol, otherwise known as AIP, is a approach to elimination and reintroduction for people that have autoimmune disease. And I say approach, I use the word template. It's actually not a diet. So the biggest misconception that people have about AIP is that it is a diet that you apply long term. AIP is actually a process that you use to go through. It might last 3 to 6, probably more realistically, 9 months, where you systematically eliminate foods that are known to cause issues for people with autoimmune disease, and then you reintroduce them at a later time when your baseline inflammation comes down so that you can identify what foods are bothering you. And then long term, you have that information and you can integrate that into the way that you eat going forward. The other thing that AIP does is it increases foods that are extremely nutrient dense. So when we take out a bunch of food categories like we do in the elimination phase, there's naturally only certain things left, and those things left are actually extremely nutrient dense foods that heal the gut, they heal the microbiome, they provide lots of nutrients and fiber and things that help our bodies recover. Because with autoimmune disease, we're usually coming, like myself, coming into this in a really depleted state due to our conditions. Our bodies really have to regenerate and repair more than normal, healthy people. And so AIP kind of does two things. It kind of removes all the triggers and then it kind of adds in all of this good stuff. And then, during the elimination phase, which is kind of the main phase, but not the only phase of AIP. So we have three phases: transition, which is getting you to the elimination. Elimination is kind of when you're avoiding all those foods and adding in all the good stuff. And then reintroduction is where you're finding out what actually works for you. You go through that, you don't apply it forever. And then, like somebody who has done AIP, like me, I did it 15 years ago. I haven't done it again. I know what foods trigger my symptoms. And I also know how the process of elimination and reintroduction works so that if I go through a period where I have a flare, I can tighten up my diet or I can expand my diet when I'm feeling great. And I just have all those skills that I learned from going through it. So that's kind of the elevator pitch of like what AIP is and what you'll get out of it.
Yes, excellent. Thank you. And really just, underlining that it isn't a diet. that elimination phase of AIP isn't meant to be, ongoing or permanent. It's something, it's a tool really that helps you or whoever's using it get to those answers of what is my personalized ideal style of eating, or, what's often called bio-individual nutrition, which is considered like really the pinnacle of nutrition, how we can nourish ourselves in a way that is right for our unique bodies. I'd love to hear from you. My audience is, of course, mostly dealing with Hashimoto's, hypothyroidism, other thyroid issues. How do you see AIP helping this community, like the thyroid community specifically? Like, what kinds of changes would you say are realistic to expect?
Yeah, so we actually have two medical studies using the autoimmune protocol specifically in people with Hashimoto. So one of the pleasures of like just the 15 years that I have been doing this is just seeing the research community get really excited about AIP. That started with some IBD studies. We've had some Hashimoto studies. We've also now, even as of a couple weeks ago, had some rheumatoid arthritis results published. And the collection of all that results in the conditions where clinical remission is an endpoint, which does not include Hashimoto's. We can talk about that more. But IBD and RA, it seems like 3 out of 4 people get meaningful improvements in about a 1 to 2 month of elimination, which is fantastic. Hashimoto's is a condition that does not have clinical remission as an endpoint. So, with Hashimoto's, we end up with hypothyroidism due to a lack of our thyroid's ability to cause or create thyroid hormone, and that causes all these symptoms of the disease. So, conventional medicine, they treat us to target, whether that's a functional target or a conventional target, but that's just getting our hormones in the right amount. And then once our hormones are correct, technically, there's really nothing they can do for us. But up to 60% of Hashimoto's patients who are treated correctly to target report having symptoms that affect them every single day. So these are the things like fatigue and brain fog and, cold hands and feet, unexplained weight gain. You guys know the list, right? So, the interesting thing about the AIP and Hashimoto's research that I really want to highlight is that both of these studies were done in people who were euthyroid and had their thyroid hormones balanced. So they were not people who were newly diagnosed, their hormones are off. The point was not to see if the diet had any effect on thyroid hormones. The point was to see what it did for the symptoms. Because again, the symptoms are the thing that Hashimoto's patients frequently have even when they are medically managed to the highest standard. So this is the reason why I don't like the word clinical remission when we talk about Hashimoto's. It's not a word that anybody uses in the literature, and it's because there is no benchmark, right? When people have no antibodies or low antibodies, sometimes they have horrible symptoms. Sometimes when people have high antibodies, they have no symptoms. We have seen all of that as clinicians all across the board. And just having someone's hormone balance doesn't tell us if somebody is going to have a high symptom burden. So in both of these studies, so there's one in US, 17 people, they did a 6-week transition and then an 8-week elimination. The results that they saw was a symptom improvement across the board. So they used a couple different ways of measuring the symptoms. One of them is validated, and all that means is that it's a questionnaire that research has shown that that is an accurate way of determining if somebody, like, what their symptom burden is. And then they also used an MSQ, which for anybody who's been to like a functional medicine doctor, this is that 5-page questionnaire with all the different organs and systems and bodies. This questionnaire is not validated, but it gives us a lot more information about all the different types of symptoms. And we know Hashimoto's can affect any organ or system in the body because it is actually, thyroid hormone is required for every cell of our body. So this is why we are not crazy if we're saying, I have symptoms in XYZ area. It could be absolutely true that you have a symptom that seems very specific and weird that could be related to your thyroid, but that's kind of another point. So this US team, this is the functional medicine study, they kept thyroid hormone levels stable. They saw a huge improvement in both of those symptom questionnaires, but they also had a blood test where they checked HSCRP, which is a marker of inflammation, and the average of the group was a reduction in 29%, which that is a pretty good indicator that, something great was shifting. And then in the Polish study, so this is the second study, about 30 people, so almost twice the size. They did 3 months in elimination and they did a couple different things. So they tested anthropometrics. So they were able to have people come into the clinic and do like a DEXA scan and get their weight on the same scale. Because when you're doing it for science, you can't have people just like weigh themselves at home and say, this is my weight for the day. You actually have to have everybody come in, have the scale be calibrated, because they're going to report the results. And what they found, oh, they also did a thyroid ultrasound, which is really cool so they could see the inflammation. They found that over the 12 weeks, people were eating the same amount of calories before and after. And this was actually a dietitian-led study. So they were actually prescribing meal plans and telling people exactly based on their size and their activity what to eat. Um, Despite not changing anything with their hormones, not changing anything with the energy density. So, this is the calories. They were not restricted in calories. They lost an average of 8 pounds over 12 weeks. And they also lost 10% relative body fat. So, most of that weight loss actually came from fat, which is really important. We don't want people losing muscle when they lose weight. And they also saw a reduction in thyroid volume and inflammation in ultrasound. And this is in addition to the symptom scores. So for the Hashimoto's community, what's really great is that we have these two studies. They were a little bit different. I definitely didn't talk about everything about the studies. There's a lot more that we learned. But really, what we know is that the elimination phase can be very productive in helping people manage those symptoms, even when their thyroid hormone levels are normal or they're treated to target, which is really amazing.
Wow. Oh my gosh. Mickey, I'm learning so much. I mean, I was familiar with the Hashimoto's studies, but thank you for, kind of expounding on those in detail and for all the tireless work and crusading you've done around getting more scientific evidence and educating people on the fact that this is scientifically backed. We do now have a lot of data on the fact that this works and is helping people feel better. And as a health coach who has worked with lots and lots of people who have, used all kinds of different tools, including AIP, I can absolutely attest to, seeing that play out in real life in my community of thyroid thrivers and in my own lived experience using AIP as a tool in helping manage those symptoms. And also, I just want to add, like, high five, and I'm with you 100% on the ideal goal really being symptom management, symptom and disease management versus chasing the holy grail of remission, which, sells really well on Reels and TikToks and stuff. But in reality, I think it can really send people down like a rabbit hole that where they end up feeling like, oh, I didn't do it right because I failed at this idea of remission, instead of focusing on all the gains that they've had by making these changes, helping with their, improve their quality of life, helping to diminish some of the residual symptoms that medication can leave behind. So, yeah, so much to think about and talk about there. But I really want to talk about your book. This is your fourth book. So it started, as I mentioned, with the Autoimmune Paleo Cookbook, one of the very first AIP cookbooks ever published, followed by the Autoimmune Wellness Handbook that you co-authored with Angie Alt, then the Nutrient Dense Kitchen, which I love. And now, 7 years later, your new book, the new Autoimmune Protocol, a definitive updated guide to the Autoimmune Protocol that I think a lot of people have been waiting for. The science clearly has evolved, the body of evidence and research has grown, the community has grown, and you've witnessed and helped shape that from the beginning. So I'd love to hear from you, like, why did AIP need to evolve?
Yeah, thanks for that. So, I mean, since you've been through the beginning, you probably have seen AIP go through these different phases. So, early on, it was really anecdotal wildfire growth, right? Everyone was just telling their friends, like, hey, this is working for me. And then people who were into it or kind of in different food communities, maybe knew how to cook, knew how to implement special diets, they were the ones who were taking it on. But there was a big group of people who found out about it and just immediately said, there's no way I can do that, right? This is way too hard. They just don't have the cooking skills or, the resources or the support or whatever. And around the same time, there was all this research. So this is about starting 2015 or so. All of the studies started to happen around, 2019. We had results of a few different studies. And really what we were seeing were these two patterns. Some people were really struggling with implementation. So, actually implementing the elimination phase, which at the time, spoiler alert, the original AIP is now called core AIP, and that eliminated grains, legumes, dairy, eggs, nuts, seeds, and nightshades. This is a lot of food categories, right? A lot of people just really struggled with that. The second thing that we noticed was that through the studies, so I didn't talk about the IBD study, but in that study, which actually had clinical remission as an indicator, because for IBD, the doctor goes in with a scope and a camera and can actually visually inspect the tissue. So those patients reached clinical remission at 6 weeks, 73% of them, and then they maintained that all through the elimination phase. And what was really interesting was that that happened during transition. So they weren't even actually fully in AIP yet, and all of the patients who reached that clinical remission stayed that way through elimination, but nobody got like added to that category, if that makes sense. So whatever was happening kind of happened as a result of those first few eliminations. So when that came out, that kind of put a light bulb for me, like maybe there's a pathway to doing this that is less extreme. And so that kind of got the gears starting. I talked to my partner at AIP Certified Coach, which is the practitioner training program that I teach, Jamie Hartman, and we talked about it. And we decided that we wanted to interview the researchers. We wanted to interview the clinicians. We wanted to talk to members of the AIP community who had like a long-term experience with AIP and just kind of poll everyone. Like, what do you think about the elimination phase? What was meaningful to you? And what turned out not to be a problem. And we saw a lot of themes just in that there were some food categories that not a lot of people reported reacting to. So we decided to create a second pathway to elimination called Modified AIP. And we launched this in 2023 after about a year of exploring this through all the different channels. And the idea was to kind of soft launch it to the practitioner community, to the public, but not really publish anything yet because we kind of wanted to see what would happen. Kind of back to those early days of AIP, that's what we were all doing, right? We were experimenting, we were writing about it, and we were reporting what was happening to each other. We kind of wanted to see what would happen with Modified, and people loved it. The practitioners loved it. The practitioner community was like, this is actually what we have been doing to personalize AIP with our certain clientele since the beginning. So, since that feedback was so good, I decided that it was time to have a formally updated print resource for AIP that not only incorporated all of the medical research, which now we're at like 9 studies, many of them, done in specific conditions, which with actual humans, which is completely different to, when the AIP originated, it was based on like theory and animal models. Now we actually have studies in people that can inform what we do. And we also have this modified approach that is based on that practitioner clinical experience, the experience of the community. And what it does is because it adds in a few more extra foods. So with modified, we include rice, but not any other grains. We include legumes, except peanuts and soy, because those are still common triggers. We include seeds, and that includes pseudograins like quinoa and buckwheat, which are actually seeds. And then we also include ghee, but not other dairy. And I know that's like a small amount of foods, but those foods really make AIP much more approachable and sustainable, affordable. And those people that just found it too hard, that is really bridging the gap for a lot of them without sacrificing any of the results that people get with core AIP.
I've heard a lot of good feedback too from my community about modified AIP versus core. And someone just made the point the other day in my YouTube comments, like, you can always start with modified AIP. And if you need to, level up to core, like there's some wiggle room here. And I think I love that it sort of gives us a little bit of wiggle room and it really almost shifts the mindset of, there's more than one way to go about this. We don't have to be super duper rigid about how we approach this. And you can still get very meaningful results without having to do the more strict core AIP. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really, really happy to hear that feedback from your community because really that's what we're hearing about to the point where I'm actually recommending now for anybody listening, if you're going to start AIP, just start with modified, especially because of a lot of the research coming out about microbiome health and like legumes in particular, they have protein. So now vegetarians can even do AIP. And then, legumes and seeds together really add in like a diversity of fiber that I think is very nourishing to the microbiome. So
Mhm.
I'm really excited about modified, and I'm really glad to hear that feedback from your community.
And it opens up more like spices too, which I found my most recent foray into AIP. I've used it a few times throughout my healing journey, especially when my gut health has maybe gone off the rails a little bit for whatever reason. Um, it just from my own standpoint, it was much easier to be able to incorporate some different, more and varied spices
Yep.
into cooking, and not feel so limited in that. I mean, for me, that was one of the biggest, hurdles just as a foodie and somebody who loves to cook and eat. I'm also a huge fan of the transition phase. Why, in your opinion, do you think the transition phase is such a game changer? And can you maybe like paint a little bit of a picture of what the transition phase looks like in real life?
Yeah, I'm so happy you asked this question because back in the day when people heard about AIP, they just started it on a Monday, right? They just, cleared out their pantry, printed out the food list, and then expected themselves to all of a sudden know how to prep and cook and shop. And like it was very overwhelming. So now, with this book, transition is a formal phase. And it's really where you're going from the way that you're eating to the elimination phase. Now, the way that everybody eats and lives their life when it comes to food is completely different. We're all starting in different places. We might be eating everything and have like a very strong culinary background. Maybe we are great cooks, we have every single gadget, but they eat everything. So actually, the what you're going to be eating is going to be the hard part. Other people might actually already be like on a gluten-free or a paleo diet, but they really don't understand a lot of cooking or techniques. And, there's a big gap to bridge in actually the implementation. Other people might not have a lot of time in their schedule to actually manage, the time it's going to take to shop and cook. So everybody just has these different barriers. And the transition phase is where you identify those barriers and then kind of pre-solve them so that when you go to elimination, it's already routine. It's already easy, right? You've already figured out where you're going to get all the food. You've already figured out, the bulk olive oil from Costco or, the ground meat from natural grocers or wherever that is affordable and accessible and kind of in your routine, but you need some time to practice it. So during the transition phase, I recommend people do 5 things. The first is to track their baseline symptoms because if you start changing things, you're going to start feeling different. And if you don't have that baseline tracking, everybody thinks they're never going to forget how much pain they're in. But I promise you, from all my years of coaching, the second it goes away, you're like, bye, never knew you, right? And it becomes really hard to tell if something is causing a reaction then in the future if you just don't have that baseline. So track your baseline. The second thing that I like to do is to clarify your personal health vision. So I have like journaling exercise in the book. This is really like why you want to get healthy, how you are, what you're going to do when you feel a little bit of improvement in your symptoms. And really kind of why that foundational, like digging deep when things get hard, what are you going to turn back to, you know? So I have an exercise for that. The third exercise is a confidence assessment. So, like all these different areas like cooking, skill, financial resources, support, I have an exercise where you can rate yourself and then give yourself some ideas for bringing your confidence up if you have an area of low confidence. So, maybe like, support, I ask you to rate on a 1 to 10. Maybe you have a 5 in your support confidence. So maybe talking to a couple friends or joining a AIP Hashimoto support group online will help you bring your confidence up so that you feel like you have some people in your life that you can talk to about what you're doing. And then the fourth is to pick a start date. And that start date is going to be enough time that gives you time to take action on your confidence tasks. So for some people, it might be a few days or a week. For other people, it actually might be a month or more because, like, if you don't know how to cook, you've always eaten out or you've had convenience food, you're not going to learn how to cook in a week, you know? But maybe like 3 weeks or a month and like an in-person class or going on YouTube and watching a bunch of cooking videos, depending on kind of what it works for you and what's accessible, you're going to pick that start date that gives you enough time to do all of those things and practice. Maybe practice some recipes, maybe make some meal plans, and then that last thing is going to be actually taking action and waiting to the start date. So thank you for asking about the transition phase because I think a lot of people miss it, but really spending like that month to 6 weeks, it really doesn't have to have a specific time frame. But I really want people to think intentionally about it because then once you hit elimination, you're ready, right? You are
Mhm.
prepped. You're good to go.
Yeah.
You have that personal motivation from your why. You've got your baseline so you know where you started. You've done all of these tasks and you're like ready to go.
It makes such a huge difference to plan and prepare too. I mean, I always say you can do anything if you plan it and just really give yourself the gift of some time to think through this. It's wonderful to feel enthusiastic and excited about a new tool like this when you find it. But I also, in listening to you talk about the transition phase, listening with my coach ears, I'm just hearing and this is how we avoid so many of the pitfalls of the autoimmune protocol. Like when we jump in with both feet and we're not prepared, we can sort of run into trouble. Like one thing that happened, I think, early on in AIP, early AIP history, was people would maybe jump in and not fully understand, like, oh, this isn't a diet I stay on long term. Like this elimination phase, there's actually a really important reintroductions or like you said, what are some, foods that are going to work for me and my budget or recipes that work for my cooking skills? Do I need meal plans? Where are my, hurdles? I'd love to hear from you about maybe like avoiding AIP pitfalls. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you see people make when they try AIP? And how might we avoid those? Other than, of course, the transition phase, which is a really
Yeah.
wonderful addition to the new autoimmune protocol.
Yeah, so yeah, you definitely highlighted just tr doing a transition phase. The second in the same vein would be the reintroduction phase. Some people do the elimination phase, they get cozy, they feel better, right?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
then when you feel better, I did this, I felt so much better, and then I was like, I never want to go back. So I'm actually not very interested in reintroducing foods. And in some people, they get scared because maybe it manages their pain and their inflammation so much, and they are just so happy to have their life back that they think, I am not going to reintroduce any foods because I don't want to throw it all away. Well, I will tell you, reintroductions are an essential part of the process. So you don't go to elimination, you stay there forever. That is too restricted of a diet. It's just going to be too hard on your mental health. It's going to be hard on your supporters. It's going to be, frankly, pretty expensive and a lot of time consuming. And you're also going to be missing out on some foods. I don't want to say that like core AIP or the elimination phase is extremely nutrient dense. It can support all of your needs nutritionally while you're doing it. But there are other things to consider, like I said, about modified, the legumes, some microbiome supportive fiber, nuts and seeds. These are things that have lots of nutrients if they're foods that you tolerate. Some of the foods are also really convenient and affordable long term. So, like rice. Rice is not something that a lot of people are reacting to. If you are an athlete or you're somebody who's more on the underweight spectrum, having a source of carbohydrates can be so important, right?
Hmm.
So I don't want people to miss out on the expansion piece because that is an essential part. It's not about being controlling or strict long term. That can be hard on people's mental health. And, we really see long term, people are kind of healing their guts and they're kind of reaching new heights of wellness even after they have reintroduced foods. So I guess that would lead into maybe a second pitfall is thinking that all of the healing you get during elimination is kind of where it's going to top out. Elimination is really just to help you identify what foods are causing your symptoms. Long term, as you avoid foods that cause symptoms or inflammation for you, and you continue to add in nutrient dense foods, which many people learn about during elimination. So, you learn about how fermented foods might make your motility and your gut feel great. You might learn how bone broth makes your skin and your hair just feel really healthy and luxurious, whatever that is for you. For me, liver pate gives me energy. I really think that the vitamin A is really important for those of us with thyroid conditions. So after AIP, I incorporate all these things into my diet. So it's not always just a negative thing too. And then those things can continue to build your health over time.
You raise such a good point that reintroductions can be one of the trickiest parts of AIP. And I tell a little story in the beginning of the Thyroid 30 cookbook about the first time I tried AIP. And, like I think I learned about it from my doctor at the time. I was working with a naturopath and she was like, we can incorporate this into some gut healing work that we were doing as, kind of foundational root cause work to try and address some of my Hashimoto's symptoms. And at the time, we were remodeling our kitchen. So we were cooking in the garage on like a hot plate. And I
Oh.
didn't know what I was getting myself into. I was just like, oh, this is just a diet and I just need to do this for 30 days. I just like I white knuckled my way through it. But because I was doing it under these really challenging circumstances, like when I was done with the 30 days that we had agreed on, I basically just went back to eating like everything except for gluten and dairy, maybe like overnight. And so what happened in that is I completely missed this opportunity to really identify like all these foods that I've been eliminating for 30 days, nightshades, eggs, things like that. I really missed the opportunity to pinpoint and identify what is this food, what response does it spark in my body? And so, yeah, I always like tell people don't, think about timing. And I think that transition phase, again, going back to the transition phase and the helpfulness of that is so key to really think through like, is timing an issue? Maybe when I'm cooking in the garage on a hot plate isn't the best time to try AIP for the first time. Or maybe I could do now, these days we have modified AIP. I could have tried something like that, which would have given me a lot more flexibility back then. But, I think it's easy for people to get impatient like I did, or, another thing people sometimes run into, I think, when jumping into this is they end up inadvertently ending up on a really calorie restricted diet because they're not eating enough on AIP. Is that
Mhm.
something that you've seen, and what can people do to kind of avoid that?
Yeah, yeah, you bring up a lot of great points. And actually, thank you for sharing that story because it really is common. A lot of people who think of it as like a whole 30, which I love a whole 30
Hmm.
for, certain people, but really it's not a 30-day thing. 30
Right.
days is the minimum elimination that I recommend. But really to thoughtfully do AIP, you need 3 to 6 months minimum. And a lot of people hear that and go, well, I'm gonna have to travel or I'm gonna have to go to a wedding. And like I promise you, you can figure out how to do those things within AIP. There are now at this point, so many people have done it. There's so much advice and strategies that you can use. So you do not need like a perfect 9 month window where you are at home and are not going to like leave your house to do AIP. People have done AIP under all types of circumstances and been successful. But if you think of it as that 30-day thing, you white knuckle through it and then, you go eat like a gluten-free pizza on day one, it's like, yeah, you missed the opportunity for reintroduction. So thank you so much for sharing that. I appreciate that. And then I forgot the second question that you asked.
Oh, I
Sorry.
was asking about just how people might avoid ending up inadvertently on a super calorie restricted.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. This is a
not
great
eating
question.
enough on AIP. That's something I've
Okay.
experienced. Like,
Yeah.
oh, I am
Yeah.
not eating enough. Now I'm like, yeah, I'm having symptoms from being calorie
Yeah.
restricted. I'm not meaning to be calorie restricted. And I've heard that from, some coaching
Yeah.
clients too, where they're like, this didn't work
Yeah.
for me because of that.
Yeah, for people that are not eating enough calories on AIP, there's usually a couple things going on. The first thing is they don't know what foods to buy or cook in order to feed themselves. So then they start relying on things that are kind of like meal adjacent to get by instead
Hmm.
of actually buying a whole suite of protein and vegetables and fat and creating a meal. And I would say that,
Hmm.
if this is you, modified is going to make it a lot easier because you have some other sources of carbs and, rice. But actually, the starchy carbs are something that for people doing core AIP, it's the number one mistake that people make and can actually lead to worsening, especially if you have a thyroid disorder and you feel like more tired or you have headaches when you start AIP. If you've never really incorporated like sweet potatoes or plantains or winter squash into your diet before. Maybe you love eating salads and you love eating vegetables and you know how to cook meat, but then you're just all of a sudden eating this accidentally low carb diet. People with thyroid disease can actually feel very unwell, right? There's a lot of debate about low carb and thyroid disease, and I'm not going to get into, what side I'm on.
Sure.
But we do need insulin in order to convert T4 into T3, which is the inactive to active thyroid hormone. And this is why when people do a low carb diet, initially they kind of get more tired, they feel super fatigued. So that is one thing that can happen a lot is just and they do it by accident. They just
Mhm.
look at the list of foods to include and they're like, great, I'm gonna have grilled chicken on salad. I'm gonna have some salmon, I'm gonna have some fish, maybe, some root vegetables. They might pick like carrots and all of a sudden they're like not eating any of those sweet potato, squash, plantain. And then again, modified makes it a lot more easy because you can have rice, you can have quinoa. So you can do a side, and that just really makes it feel a little more like a complete meal when
Hmm.
you have those items. The other thing too is, people that don't prep, I think sometimes if you're kind of like working from home and then it's lunchtime and then your routine is to like just go look in the fridge and see what's there. That is a recipe for undereating. I don't know about you guys, but for me, when I have those days where I just haven't thought out the elements of my meal, whether that's like a complete serving of protein, which for me is like 4 to 6 ounces, some root vegetables, some greens, maybe a scoop of fermented veggies. That's kind of what I like to have for like a complete meal. But sometimes, like, I'll open the fridge and it's like I didn't really think that through. And so then it's just little bits of things and a piece of fruit, and that is definitely how you end up with not having enough calories. So for
Yeah.
anyone who's there, planning, prep, make sure that you have some elements ahead of time. I like if you're having a lot of low capacity days, I like to really plan ahead so that you always have something that you don't have to actually cook, whether that is having something in the fridge already prepped or having something in the freezer that is like a complete meal. So a lot of my soups and stews and chilies, I batch cook and I will throw them into glass jars, put them in the freezer. And then when I have a day that I'm just not feeling it, I can open that up. I have like a library of a few different things so I don't get burnt out on anything, and then just defrost and eat that. And it's like good to go.
I love these practical tips, Mickey. Thank you for sharing them. I always say meal prep and planning is one of the best things you can do. We want to avoid the hangries.
Yep,
If you're
100%.
starting on AIP or any other, therapeutic anti-inflammatory dietary protocol, have food on hand and meals. I think that's where like meal planning, I mean, even 30 minutes of just sitting down and thinking through some meals. Maybe you get some cookbooks as resources or you find different websites you like, different recipe creators you like. Give yourself the gift of that time to do some intentional planning. I think even just the act of eating regular balanced meals can be incredibly profound in terms of how it makes us feel because so many of us aren't aware of how much grazing we're doing. We're grabbing the bar, we're thinking, oh, well, I have thyroid issues, so maybe I'm carrying some excess weight. So it's actually a good thing if I just have this apple for a snack without any added protein or healthy fats or just we're undernourishing ourselves. And so often I hear when people start to eat more and eat more intentionally by weaving in some of that planning, things just start to really click for people. So thank you for sharing those tips. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And Jenny, I want to make also one point about the Hashimoto study is that, the Polish study, they had Hashimoto's patients that were not eating any less. So they were not restricting any calories and they still lost weight. And so I love that you just explained how thyroid patients often think we should be eating less because we're trying to manage our condition, but really nourishing yourself, especially early in the day. So breakfast, if that's just making sure that you have something that is very like protein rich, has some fiber, has some vegetables, maybe even some broth. I'm a big fan of like a breakfast soup.
Mhm.
Will actually change the trajectory of your energy stability throughout the day. So, yeah, I love that we're having this chat. But just a reminder that you can still eat more food and lose weight because that's actually what they showed in the study, which is, what coaches like myself, we have been seeing for years, but it's
Mhm.
just really hard to convince people that that's a real thing
Mhm.
because of all of our experience that we've had with this disease, that sometimes it can just be really challenging when our body is working against us.
I echo that 100%. I see it. It's surprisingly common how many people find that, oh, I'm actually eating more
Mhm.
and I feel better and I'm dropping some unwanted weight as well. So,
Yep. So,
yeah,
so you don't need to restrict calories. You don't need to
yeah,
layer any of that onto AIP. You just do AIP for the symptoms and for the inflammation and for your body, and then you'll see how that helps change the way that you feel. It's
yeah.
really powerful.
Well, before we run out of time, I'd love to spend a little time talking about food and recipes, our favorite subject here on the show. And as two fellow food lovers and cooks, do you have any favorite recipes from the new book or like a meal you'd recommend someone start with?
Okay, so I have a lemongrass chicken soup that I have built as a breakfast. Again, like I said, I love a breakfast soup. You can make it for any meal, and I use this technique where I historically have done lots of soups with a whole chicken, which you need to know how to cook a whole chicken. Most people can do it. But I will say over the years, I have observed that a lot of people just don't make those recipes. And I wanted to figure out how I could hack getting the person who is like introductorily using some, animal products with the bones and get that nice rich broth without actually having to handle a whole chicken. And so my answer is bone in, skin on chicken thighs. And I make a soup where I simmer that lots, 3 pounds of chicken with the bone, with the skin, simmer it until everything is like falling off the bone, and then turn that into a stock that like makes the soup. And I like to blend some spinach so that the broth is green, cooked in lemongrass with some veggies. It's super nourishing, super delicious, and it has that kind of bone broth flavor without having to have made bone broth before, which I thought was really clever and fun. So I use that method with a couple different recipes in the book. I've also got a modified one that's more like a Mediterranean flavor with some garbanzo beans and olives, which is fun. But yeah,
Yum.
I just
My
like that
mouth is
method.
watering. And Mickey, you actually turned me on to breakfast soups with some of your other breakfast soup recipes from your other cookbooks that I have on my shelf. And it absolutely was like, oh, this is actually a wonderful way to start the day. It's so delicious and really shifted my mindset as a recipe creator too. So thank you for, not just
Oh.
the great recipes, but that inspiration. But those sound amazing. I can't wait to try that with the lemongrass. Yum, yum, yum. And also, yeah, just great practical tips and tools and approaches to think about. It just really shows you've been at this for a while. You've put in your 10,000 hours, right? There is a level of mastery here, you guys, with Mickey and what she has to offer and her recipes. So do not sleep on this cookbook. I know that it's such an incredibly valuable resource. And you've also got a free AIP Foundation series to help people get started with this. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and thank you for the kind words about the recipes. Honestly, having you comment on that as with your background as a chef is really meaningful to me. So thank you so much.
Oh, I
Um,
love it. Your
yeah.
recipes are great. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. So for anybody who wants to get some info about AIP, maybe, you're interested in getting started in the future, I have this series on my site called the AIP Foundation series. It's at theautoimmuneprotocol.com. Pretty much anywhere on the website in the footer, you can put in your email, and you'll get 6 days of emails that include the food list. So, the lists of things to include and avoid. You'll get a 2 week meal plan. You'll get some different resources for reintroduction and transition. So, you'll be all set up after that first week with over 60 pages of free stuff for you to get started. So, yeah.
Wow, that sounds like an incredible and very comprehensive resource. And, also your AIP resources I point people to them all the time. So you guys know this is going to be it's going to answer a lot of your questions and help you really get started with this. Mickey, thank you so much for being here. I always love chatting with you, and thanks for sharing so much wisdom and expertise with us today. I have a million more questions I'd love to ask you, but I will look forward to holding that brand new book in my hands. And just thank you for all the work you've done too to make AIP, the Autoimmune Protocol, more available and accessible to the community. Where can people learn more and connect with you and buy the book?
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a great interview, and I appreciate all the questions, especially about Hashimoto's, because, we are just so misunderstood in the autoimmune community. So, thank you for what you do. So, you guys if you're interested in the book, you can buy it anywhere that books are sold, including internationally. Kindle is available. So, I know, you probably have a lot of international listeners. There are some international English edition, like UK, Canada, Australia. I think the print book can be had, but anywhere else, you guys can get the Kindle and come hang out with me on Instagram. I'm at Mickey Trescott.
Awesome. Well, for the listeners, I will put all those links into the show notes for everything we talked about on today's episode. And Mickey, congrats on
Thank
bringing
you.
another amazing and valuable book baby into the world, the new Autoimmune Protocol. Everyone, go check it out. I am so thrilled to add this book to my collection and to be able to share it with this community. So, congrats. And again, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for spending this time with me and tuning into today's episode of the Thyroid Healthy Bites podcast. If you've enjoyed today's show, please don't forget to like, subscribe, or leave a review on your podcast platform of choice. Your support makes this show possible. For more thyroid healthy food and lifestyle inspiration, check out my free library of thyroid-friendly recipes and lifestyle content at hypothyroidchef.com and the Hypothyroid Chef YouTube channel. As we wrap it up, head to the show notes for information and links to everything we talked about today, along with the link to my free thyroid-friendly grocery guide download. I'm Ginny Mahar, your thyroid health and cooking coach, wishing you happy cooking, happy thriving, and the best of health. See you next time.